For 10 years he paid no attention to the strange mound near the shed. But as soon as he dug into it, his discovery prompted him to call the police immediately. Subscribe and write where you're watching this video from. Ezra Miller had lived alone for so many years that the creak of the old floorboards and the whisper of wind through the eaves had become his only constant companions. At 76, his life moved at a pace as slow and deliberate as the turning of the seasons, and he preferred it that way. The small, weathered house sat on the very edge of a sleepy southern town, far from the busier streets where children played and neighbors exchanged gossip on their porches. Out here, there was only the rustling of leaves, the chirp of cicadas in summer, and the low hum of the distant highway, a reminder that the world was still turning beyond his quiet little boundary. The yard around his home told the story of a man who had once worked the land with his own hands. The grass was uneven, but tended with care. Patches of vegetables grew stubbornly in neat rows despite the sandy soil, and beside the house, an old wooden shed leaned slightly, as though it were tired from years of holding in the smell of oil, rust, and cedar. Ezra spent much of his day here, mending tools or simply standing in the doorway, watching the light shift across the ground. The shed, like Ezra himself, had weathered storms and sun without complaint. It was behind this shed, along the far edge of his property near the old fence line, that the peculiar mound had first appeared. He remembered noticing it not long after moving in, nearly a decade ago. At first, it was nothing, just a soft rise in the earth, the kind you might find after a heavy rain had washed soil from one place to another. He thought little of it, assuming it was the result of uneven landscaping, or perhaps the settling of the ground after the previous owners had removed a tree. In those early days, there had been too much else to occupy his mind. He was adjusting to life after selling his farm, to the loss of his wife Clara, and to the way silence seemed to fill the space where her voice had once been. Ezra's days were simple now. He rose before dawn, more out of habit than necessity, and brewed a pot of strong coffee. On mornings, when the air was cool and the dew still clung to the grass, he would sit on the porch with his cup and watch the first blush of sunlight creep across the fields beyond his property. He liked the stillness of that hour, when even the birds seemed reluctant to begin their song. The mound behind the shed was not a pressing matter in those moments. It was simply a bump in the earth, one of many small details that made up the landscape of his life. But over the years, the mound had changed. It was subtle at first, perhaps an inch taller one season, a little wider the next. Ezra noticed that the grass atop it was never quite as green as the rest of the yard, as if the soil beneath was reluctant to nourish anything that tried to grow there. Sometimes, after a long spell without rain, the earth would crack along its crest, revealing a dark, compacted layer beneath. He would look at it while trimming the fence line, frowning slightly, but he always found an excuse to leave it alone. It's just the ground settling, he told himself. Nothing more. The truth was, Ezra was not a man to go digging without reason. Decades of farming had taught him respect for the land and for the secrets it sometimes kept. He knew that what lay beneath the soil could be as benign as a forgotten tree root or as troubling as an old septic line. Yet there was something about this mound, something in the way it seemed to shift slightly with each passing year, that tugged at his attention. On warm afternoons, when the sun cast long shadows across the yard, Ezra would sometimes find himself standing at the edge of the mound, staring down at it. The shed loomed nearby, its wood siding darkened with age, and the air would be heavy with the scent of cut grass. He'd tap the mound lightly with the toe of his boot, feeling the firmness of the ground. too firm for just loose soil. And once, he could not remember if it was 3 years ago or 4, he thought he heard a faint metallic sound when he struck it, but the moment passed quickly, and he told himself it was nothing more than a rock buried deep below. The neighbors rarely came by, but those who did sometimes remarked on his quiet existence. They saw the solitary man who kept to himself, who maintained his yard and waved politely, but never lingered in conversation. They did not know that Ezra's mind was often occupied by memories of the farm he once ran with his brother before the land was sold, of the army years that had taken him overseas, and of the long evenings spent on the porch with Clara, talking about everything and nothing. The mound was a minor curiosity in comparison to the weight of those memories. Still, as each year passed, the mound grew a little more pronounced, until it could no longer be ignored. In the wet months, puddles would form around its base, but the top remained oddly dry, the water sliding off as if repelled. In summer, the grass on its sides thinned, leaving bare patches of soil that baked under the sun. And always there was that sense of something beneath, something solid, immovable, and patient. Ezra told himself he would deal with it someday, perhaps when the weather was cooler or when he felt more inclined to dig. Yet he never did. The seasons came and went, and the mound remained, growing slowly but steadily, as if waiting for him to take notice. He did not speak of it to anyone, not even to the few old friends who still called on occasion. It was his land, his shed, his mound. Whatever it was, it could wait. That autumn, however, something shifted, not in the mound itself, but in Ezra's perception of it. The air was crisp, and the leaves had begun to fall, scattering across the yard like fragments of gold and copper. One morning, while walking to the shed to fetch a rake, he paused beside the mound and realized it was now nearly up to his knee. It cast a small but definite shadow in the morning light, and for the first time it looked less like a natural formation and more like something placed there with intention. He stood there for a long while, the rake forgotten in his hand, studying the slope of the earth. The ground felt firmer than ever beneath his boot, and he thought he caught that metallic echo again when he tapped it. A faint memory stirred in the back of his mind, of places overseas where he had seen similar rises in the ground, where soldiers whispered about what might be buried beneath. The thought unsettled him, though he quickly dismissed it. This was his backyard, not some far-off field. And yet the unease lingered. By the time he returned to the porch that evening, the sun was setting in a blaze of red and gold, and the mound was just a dark shape in the fading light. Ezra sat in his chair sipping his coffee, his eyes drifting again towards the shed and the earth beside it. He told himself, as he had many times before, that there was no rush. But deep down, he knew the truth. The mound had been patient long enough, and sooner or later he would have to decide what to do about it. The first frost came early that year, and with it, the brittle stillness of late autumn. Ezra noticed the shift in the air before he even stepped outside each morning. The sense of cut grass and warm soil had been replaced by the sharp bite of cold, and the ground crunched faintly underfoot. He went about his chores as he always did, wrapping himself in his thick coat and pulling his hat low over his brow. But something about that season's light made the mound behind the shed stand out more starkly than ever before. It was no longer a mere lump in the earth blending into the yard. It was a presence. He could see it from his porch now, even at a distance, and it seemed to have gained a strange prominence in the landscape. The frost gathered differently upon it than on the rest of the yard, while the surrounding grass glistened silver in the morning sun. The mound's crest was often bare, as if the frost melted there first or never fully formed. Ezra found this unsettling. He told himself it was likely due to the shape, perhaps catching more sunlight, but deep down he suspected something else, something beneath the surface generating its own subtle heat, or simply resisting the cold in a way that living soil should not. On a particularly raw morning, Ezra carried his coffee to the shed and stopped halfway, his eyes drawn to the base of the mound. The grass there had thinned further, exposing dark earth packed tight and hard as brick. He crouched down, pressing his palm against it. Even through his glove, he could feel the density of the ground, a density that did not belong to natural soil. The memory of the faint metallic sound from years before whispered through his mind. He pulled his hand back slowly, as though afraid the earth might shift under his touch. In the weeks that followed, the weather turned wet. Heavy rains swept through the town, filling ditches and swelling the creek that wound its way behind the neighboring properties. Ezra watched from his window as water pooled across the yard, collecting in shallow depressions and soaking into the ground. Yet, when he glanced toward the mound, he noticed something strange. Water gathered at its base but never lingered on top. It was as though the earth there was thirsty, drawing the rain down faster than nature allowed. On one occasion, after a night of relentless rainfall, he ventured outside at dawn and found the top of the mound dry, while puddles spread across the rest of the property. It was that morning when the old rumor from his army days resurfaced in his mind. Stories of caches buried in remote places, their containers sealed so tightly that they shifted and pressed against the earth as the years wore on. He pushed the thought away, but it clung stubbornly to him throughout the day, trailing him from the shed to the porch and even to the small kitchen where he fixed his dinner. One afternoon, a neighbor wandered over while Ezra was mending a section of the fence. It was Harold Pruitt, a man in his late 60s who had lived in the area longer than anyone could remember. He leaned on the fence post, his eyes drifting toward the mound. "You ever figure out what's going on with that hump back there?" he asked casually, his voice carrying the lazy drawl of the South. "Looks like it's grown a bit since the last time I saw it." Ezra shrugged without looking up from his work. "Just the ground settling, I reckon." Harold chuckled. "Settling? That thing's standing taller than a grave marker. Maybe you got yourself a family of armadillos tunneling under there. Or maybe," he paused for dramatic effect, "some old bootlegger stash from back in the day." Ezra offered a thin smile but didn't respond. He had no interest in feeding Harold's imagination, nor in hearing his own unspoken thoughts echoed back to him. After a moment, Harold tipped his hat and shuffled off, leaving Ezra alone with the quiet and the rhythmic thud of his hammer against the wood. That evening, as the sky darkened to a deep blue and the first stars emerged, Ezra found himself drawn once more to the mound. He stood there for a long time, his breath fogging in the cold air, the shed casting a long shadow across the yard. The silence was heavy, almost expectant, as though the ground itself were holding something it wanted him to find. He thought about his years overseas, about the things soldiers had buried in haste, sometimes never to return for them. The mound was not just bigger now, it was sharper in outline, more deliberate in its shape, as though whatever lay beneath was pushing upward with intent. Over the next several days, he began noticing other small changes. The soil around the mound seemed to be harder than the rest of the yard, resisting the frost in the mornings and drying quicker in the afternoons. A small crack had appeared along the top, not wide enough to see into, but enough to suggest movement underneath. He tapped it lightly with the heel of his boot and heard a muffled echo that sent a ripple of unease through him. It wasn't the hollow thud of loose dirt. It was something else. At night, lying in bed, Ezra found his thoughts drifting to that strange rise in the ground. He remembered the neighbors' joking words about bootleggers and armadillos, but his mind kept circling back to the possibility of something older, something connected to the decades before he came to live here. He pictured the previous owners, faces he barely knew, and wondered what secrets they might have left behind. He imagined a box, maybe wooden, maybe metal, lying beneath the soil for years, its edges pressing against the earth as time and weather shifted the land around it. One night, as wind rattled the windows and a branch scraped against the siding, Ezra lay awake, staring at the dark ceiling. The decision formed quietly but firmly in his mind. He would find out what was under that mound. Not right away. He wanted the ground to dry after the recent rains, but soon. The unease had rooted itself too deeply for him to ignore any longer. The mound had grown with the years, but so had his curiosity, and it was now a stronger force than his reluctance. By the end of the week, the skies had cleared and the winter sun brought a pale warmth to the afternoons. Ezra stood on the porch one morning, sipping his coffee, his eyes fixed on that spot behind the shed. The decision was made. The day would come when he would take a shovel to it, dig until he found the truth. But for now, he simply watched, the air between them heavy with the unspoken understanding that their long standoff was nearing its end. What he did not yet know was how much that decision would change the quiet rhythm of his life, how it would stir up shadows from the past and bring to light things long thought buried, both in the ground and in the memories of those who had walked the land before him. The mound was no longer just a quirk of the yard. It was a question, one that demanded an answer, and Ezra had finally decided he was ready to give it. The decision, once it had settled in his mind, grew heavier with each passing day. Ezra had never been the kind of man to rush headlong into a task without thought. But now the waiting began to feel like a weight pressing down on him. Every time he stepped outside, the mound behind the shed seemed to loom larger, almost as if it had swelled overnight. His eyes would drift toward it without his bidding, and he found himself unconsciously measuring its shape and height against the way it had been the week before. It was no longer simply a feature of his yard. It had become an unspoken challenge. The weather had turned clear, with pale winter sunlight spilling over the yard in long, slanted rays. The air was cold enough to sting his cheeks, but not so biting that it drove him indoors. That morning, he ate a quiet breakfast at the small kitchen table, the rhythmic tick of the wall clock marking time as if urging him toward the inevitable. He rinsed his plate, dried his hands slowly on a worn towel, and then opened the narrow closet where his tools leaned against one another in the shadows. The old shovel, its wooden handle smoothed by decades of use, fit into his hand with the easy familiarity of an old friend. He set it aside, pulling on a pair of stiff work gloves and the heavy boots he had worn for years while working the land. When he stepped outside, the crisp air filled his lungs, sharpening his senses. The yard was quiet, save for the distant sound of a crow calling from the bare branches of an oak. Frost still clung to the shadowed edges of the fence line, but the ground near the mound lay exposed, as though the earth there held its own strange warmth. Ezra approached slowly, each step sinking into the slightly damp soil. The mound, under the angled morning light, seemed even more defined, its edges casting subtle shadows that gave it a stubborn presence against the flatness of the yard. He stood for a moment, resting his gloved hands on the top of the shovel handle, letting his gaze travel over the rounded slope of earth. A faint, uneasy anticipation prickled at the back of his neck. He thought again of Harold's joking remark about bootlegger stashes, of his own memories from overseas where the ground sometimes hid far more than stones and roots. He tightened his grip, stepped to one side of the mound, and drove the shovel's blade into the soil. The first bite came away easily, the dirt loose from months of rain and frost, and he tossed it aside with a muted thud. He worked methodically, circling part way around the mound as he dug, removing one layer after another. At first, it was the simple resistance of compacted soil, the kind he had fought against countless times before. But then, several inches down, the shovel struck something harder than earth. The sound was faint but distinct, a dull, metallic note that traveled up the wooden handle into his hands. He froze for a moment, his breath hanging in the cold air. Bending down, he brushed the dirt away with his gloved fingers until the edge of something flat and corroded emerged from the soil. Rust had eaten into its surface, but the hard lines beneath were unmistakably the corner of a man-made object. His heartbeat quickened, and he found himself glancing over his shoulder toward the house, as if expecting someone to be watching. The yard remained silent. He dug more carefully now, using the shovel to loosen the surrounding earth before crouching to scoop it away by hand. Slowly, more of the object came into view, what looked like the lid of a large metal box, its surface mottled with rust and caked in clumps of wet dirt. The metal was cold under his touch, as though it had held the chill of decades underground. A faint, acrid scent rose from it, not unlike the smell of old machinery left too long in the rain. The box was larger than he had first thought, stretching at least 2 feet across and perhaps more in length. Its sides were wedged tightly into the earth, as though the soil had gripped it in a slow, relentless embrace. He realized it would take more than a few minutes' work to free it entirely. Straightening up, he rolled his shoulders to ease the stiffness settling there and began to widen the hole, shovelful by shovelful, until he had exposed enough of the top to see a row of corroded hinges along one side. It occurred to him then that the mound's steady growth over the years made sense. The gradual shifting of groundwater and the slow settling of the earth had worked together to push the box upward, pressing against the surface until it formed the rise he had noticed so long ago. The thought gave him a strange mixture of satisfaction and apprehension. Whatever this was, it had been hidden for a long time, waiting for someone to uncover it. Ezra set the shovel aside and crouched again, running his fingers along the edges of the box. The hinges were locked under years of rust, the seams nearly fused shut. He would need more than his bare hands to pry it open. He rose, brushing dirt from his gloves, and walked to the shed, where he rummaged through a shelf until he found a heavy steel pry bar and an old hammer. The tools felt awkwardly heavy as he returned to the mound, their weight a reminder that what he was about to do could not be undone. Positioning himself at one corner, he wedged the tip of the pry bar beneath the lip of the lid and pressed down slowly. The rust groaned in protest, and the box shuddered slightly in its earthen cradle. He worked around the edge, loosening the grip of time bit by bit, until at last a sharp crack split the air as one of the hinges gave way. The sound was louder than he expected, and it seemed to echo in the stillness of the yard. He paused, his breath coming heavier now, and for a moment he simply looked at the partially freed lid. In his mind, a dozen possibilities tumbled over one another: old farming tools, forgotten valuables, or perhaps something far darker. The faint tang of metal and damp earth was strong now, mingling with a scent he couldn't quite place, something that hinted at age and neglect. With one final push, he pried the lid open enough to see the darkness inside. At first, it appeared empty, the interior swallowed in shadow. But as his eyes adjusted, shapes began to emerge. Hard edges, wrapped forms, and the dull glint of something that caught the light. Ezra's pulse quickened. The hole yawned before him, the box, a silent relic of another time, and he knew there was no turning back. Whatever lay inside had been buried here for a reason, and now it had found its way back into the world through his hands. The cold air seemed to still around him as he leaned closer, his breath shallow, the soil damp beneath his knees. The box's contents waited in silence, holding secrets that had endured far longer than he had lived here. And, as he prepared to reach inside, a ripple of unease ran through him. Not fear, exactly, but the heavy awareness that what he was about to uncover would pull him into a story that had begun long before he ever set foot on this land. For a long moment, Ezra simply crouched there, staring into the open box as if his eyes might be deceiving him. The cold air pressed in around him, amplifying the silence until he could hear the slow rhythm of his own breath. It took a few heartbeats for the shapes inside to sharpen into recognizability, and when they did, a ripple passed through him, not of fear exactly, but of something deeper, heavier, the way one feels when standing in the doorway of a room long untouched. He hesitated, glancing once over his shoulder toward the fence line, half expecting to see someone watching, though the yard remained still and empty. He leaned closer, the smell meeting him before his hands did. It was a pungent blend of rust, mildew, and the faint trace of old cloth that had been shut away from sunlight for far too long. The first thing he touched was coarse fabric, stiff with age. Pulling it toward him, he saw it was a neatly folded uniform jacket, the color faded almost to gray, its once crisp edges softened by decades underground. The stitching was frayed in places, and a small moth hole marred the front pocket. He laid it gently on the ground beside him, the insignia on the sleeve barely visible under a thin veil of dust. Beneath the uniform lay a bundle wrapped in waxed paper that had turned brittle and yellow. Ezra peeled it back slowly, revealing several small boxes of ammunition. The brass casings had dulled to a dark patina, and each box was marked in neat military-style lettering that seemed oddly formal against their worn appearance. He set them aside carefully, his hands steady but his mind quickening with questions. Whoever had placed them here had done so deliberately, with the kind of care that spoke of value, if not in money, then in meaning. As he reached deeper into the box, his fingers closed around something cold and solid. He drew it out into the pale light, and the breath caught in his throat. It was a pistol, heavier than he expected, its blued steel dulled but not destroyed by time. The grip, worn smooth from use, still fit perfectly in his hand. For a moment, he simply held it, the weight of it stirring an echo in him from his own years in uniform. This was no random relic. It had been carried, used, perhaps even trusted, by someone who had lived and fought through a time Ezra could only know from history books and the fragmented memories of his elders. There were other objects, too. A narrow leather belt coiled neatly at the bottom, a battered tin box containing what looked like personal effects, a small folding knife, a cigarette case with initials engraved in careful script, and a pair of dog tags strung on a chain. The tags were tarnished but still legible, the letters and numbers stamped deep into the metal. Thomas K. King, followed by a string of numbers and the name of a blood type. Ezra's gaze lingered on them. A name. The box, the uniform, the weapon. These were not just things. They belonged to a man who had lived in flesh and blood, who had carried these pieces of metal and cloth through moments of his life that were now lost to everyone but him. And then there was the bag. Wedged in the farthest corner, almost hidden beneath the other contents, lay a thick canvas sack tied with cord that had stiffened over the years. Ezra pulled it free, the coarse fabric scratching against his gloves. He worked the knot loose and opened the mouth of the bag, peering inside. At first he saw only the dull brown edges of paper, but as he reached in and pulled the stack into the light, the reality struck him. Money. Bundles of old banknotes, the paper brittle but still intact, the faded ink showing denominations he hadn't seen in decades. Some were bound in strips bearing the stamp of banks long out of operation, their names familiar only from old photographs and half-forgotten headlines. Ezra sat back on his heels, the sack resting in his lap, the cold seeping through his coat, now unnoticed. His mind was a storm of questions. Who was Thomas K. King? Why had he buried all this here? The dog tags and uniform marked him as a soldier, but the money, the weapon, and the ammunition hinted at something more complicated. It wasn't just a cache of memories. It was a hidden chapter from a life that had been abruptly cut off from the world above. He set the bag aside and looked again into the box. At the very bottom lay a bundle of letters, tied with twine that had frayed so badly it came apart at his touch. The envelopes were yellowed, their corners softened, but the handwriting was still clear, a looping, deliberate script that belonged to another era. Most were addressed to Thomas K. King, but a few bore the name Annie King. Ezra brushed the dirt from one and turned it over in his hands, feeling the faint embossing of the postal seal. He didn't open them, at least not yet. There was a sense of intrusion in that act, a crossing of a line he wasn't ready to take. The wind stirred, carrying with it the faint rattle of the shed door. Ezra looked up at the yard, the fence, the fields beyond. All of it felt slightly altered now, as though the act of uncovering this box had shifted something not just in the ground, but in the very air around him. The mound was gone, reduced to a rough hole in the earth, but in its place was something far larger, a connection to a man he had never met, a mystery anchored in steel and cloth and paper, waiting for someone to decide what to do with it. Ezra gathered the items carefully, setting them in a neat row beside the box. The uniform, the pistol, the ammunition, the belt, the tin of personal effects, the bag of money, and the bundle of letters. Each seemed to radiate its own quiet gravity, pulling his thoughts into their orbit. He felt the way he had as a boy when he'd found a bird's nest tucked into the beams of the barn. An awareness that he was holding something delicate, irreplaceable, and alive with history. The light was fading by the time he rose to his feet, his knees stiff from crouching. He carried the items to the shed, setting them gently on an old workbench where they would be safe from the damp night air. The box itself, empty now, he left by the hole, its corroded shell seeming smaller without its contents. He would deal with it later. For now, his mind was too full of the weight of what he had found and the questions it had stirred. He locked the shed and stood for a moment on the path, the cold settling into his bones. The yard looked the same as it always had, the leaning shed, the weathered fence, the bare branches reaching toward the darkening sky. But he knew better. This place had kept a secret for decades, and now that secret belonged to him. He wasn't sure yet what he would do with it, But he knew one thing. Thomas K. King's story was no longer buried, and neither was his own part in it. When Ezra finally stepped back inside the house, the warmth from the small heater wrapped around him, but it couldn't drive away the chill that lingered in his chest. He thought of the dog tags, the letters, the sack of brittle currency, and he knew sleep would not come easily. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle sounded, long and low, like a voice calling across time. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at the closed shed door through the window, and felt the pull of a past he could no longer ignore. Ezra woke earlier than usual the next morning, though he had hardly slept. His dreams, when they came, were muddled and restless, flashes of strange landscapes where the ground shifted under his feet, and where voices he couldn't see whispered names he didn't know. The pale winter light was just beginning to seep into the room when he pushed back the covers and sat on the edge of the bed. The cold floor bit at his feet, but he hardly noticed it. His thoughts were already in the shed with the relics he had unearthed less than a day before. He brewed a pot of coffee, strong enough to cut through the fog in his mind, and stood at the kitchen window while it dripped into the pot. Outside, the yard looked unchanged, the shed leaning in its usual place, the patch of bare earth where the mound had been now just a rough scar in the ground. But to Ezra, the whole scene felt different, as if the air itself carried the weight of the past. He couldn't shake the image of those dog tags, the clean, deliberate letters spelling out a name that meant nothing to him and yet now seemed to follow him from room to room. After his second cup of coffee, he stepped into the cold, the air crisp enough to make his breath hang in front of him. The lock on the shed gave a reluctant click, and the hinges protested faintly when he pulled the door open. Inside, the scent of oil and wood mixed with the faint mustiness that had clung to the objects from the box. The workbench was just as he had left it. Uniform folded neatly, pistol resting to one side, the tin of personal effects, the ammunition, the sack of brittle currency, and the bundle of letters tied loosely with the frayed remains of twine. Ezra's hands hovered over the letters for a moment before he picked one up. The envelope was addressed to Thomas K. King, in a flowing hand, the ink faded but still legible. The postmark was dated 1946, just after the war had ended. He slid the letter out carefully, the paper crackling faintly. The handwriting was the same as on the envelope, steady and sure, and the first line began with, "My dear Tom." Ezra read in silence, his eyes moving slowly over the page. The words spoke of homecoming, of relief that the war was over, of longing for a man who had been far away for far too long. There were mentions of a small house, of a garden that had gone wild in his absence, and of nights spent wondering if he was alive. He set the letter down, his fingers lingering on the paper, and reached for another. This one, postmarked a year later, was shorter, the tone more urgent. It spoke of trouble, of men coming by the house asking questions, of a warning to be careful, of a plea for him to keep the box safe. Ezra felt a slow chill creep over him as the words settled into his mind. This was not simply a soldier's keepsake. The box had been hidden for a reason, and someone long ago had feared it might be taken. The dog tags lay where he had placed them the day before, and he picked them up now, running his thumb over the stamped letters. Thomas K. King. He said the name aloud quietly, as if it might stir something in the still air of the shed. Nothing answered, but the weight of the metal in his palm felt heavier than it should. He slipped them into his coat pocket, an unspoken decision forming without effort. He needed to know who this man was. Ezra wasn't much for computers, but he knew the library downtown had Old Town records and newspapers on file. It had been years since he'd stepped inside, but by mid-morning he was there, the warmth of the building washing over him as he pushed through the glass doors. The librarian was younger than he expected, a polite woman with glasses who listened as he explained that he was looking for information on someone who might have lived in the area decades ago. She guided him toward a set of old bound volumes and a microfilm reader tucked into a quiet corner. The hours passed in the low hum of the library. Ezra leafed through yellowed pages, scanning obituaries, wedding announcements, and old photographs. At first, there was nothing, and then, in a 1947 edition of the local paper, he found it. A photograph of a man in uniform, the caption reading, "Sergeant Thomas K. King returns home from overseas." The article was brief, mentioning his service in Europe, his receipt of the Purple Heart, and his plans to settle in town. There was no mention of a family, though the name Annie King appeared once, described as his sister residing in Charleston. Ezra kept reading, moving forward through the years. In a 1953 paper, there was a small, almost overlooked notice. Local man missing. Thomas K. King, 37, has not been seen for several weeks. Authorities have no leads at this time. There was no follow-up article, no resolution, just a man who had quietly disappeared from the public record. Ezra sat back in his chair, the hum of the fluorescent lights above seeming louder in the silence. The pieces were there. The war service, the return home, the sudden disappearance. But the picture they formed was incomplete. He thought about the box again, about the pistol and the money, and the letters that hinted at danger. The man had survived the war only to vanish a few years later, leaving his belongings buried in the earth behind what was now Ezra's shed. Before leaving the library, Ezra asked the librarian about property records. She showed him how to look through the old ledgers, and there he found the line he was looking for. The house and land had once been owned by Thomas K. King, sold in 1954 to a couple who lived there until the late 70s. The transaction date was a year after King had gone missing. Ezra didn't know if it meant the man had sold it before disappearing, or if someone else had done it after he was gone, but either way, the timeline gnawed at him. When he stepped back outside, the daylight was already beginning to fade. The cold bit harder now, but Ezra hardly noticed. His thoughts were on the man whose name was now a constant presence in his mind, a man whose life had intersected with his own by nothing more than the luck or misfortune of shared ground. Back home, he returned to the shed, the fading light pooling in the corners. He looked again at the pistol, the money, the uniform. He imagined King, standing in this very yard nearly 70 years earlier, perhaps digging the hole himself, lowering the box into it, covering it with earth. Was he afraid? Was he protecting something or hiding from someone? Ezra felt a weight in his chest as he closed the shed door for the night. The answers weren't here, not yet, but the questions had taken root. And as he stood looking out over the dark yard, he knew this was no longer just about curiosity. It was about a man's story that had been buried with him, about the pieces left behind and the truth hidden among them. The past was no longer content to lie quietly in the ground. It had surfaced, and now it had hold of him. The days that followed his trip to the library were marked by a peculiar restlessness. Ezra had lived alone long enough to know the rhythms of his property, the quiet hum of days that passed without incident. But now there was a new current in the air, an awareness that he was no longer the only one holding the knowledge of what lay in that shed. Whether it was paranoia or instinct, he could not say, but he felt it in the way his eyes drifted to the road more often, in the way the stillness of the night seemed more brittle than before. The weight of the discovery was no longer just on his workbench. It had settled into him, into the very pace of his days. It began subtly. The first sign came one gray afternoon when he noticed tire tracks in the thin strip of mud by the fence line. It was not unusual for neighbors to pass by, but these tracks stopped oddly close to the edge of his property, as if someone had pulled up and sat there for a while. He told himself it could have been anyone. Someone turning around, maybe even Harold Pruitt in his old pickup, but the thought didn't quite settle. Later that evening, as the light drained from the sky, he thought he saw a figure standing just beyond the fence, a shadow between the bare trees. When he looked again, it was gone, and he told himself it had been a trick of the fading light. Still, he lingered at the window longer than usual, watching the darkness thicken. Ezra tried to keep his routines. He still tended to the garden beds when the weather allowed, still split wood for the small stove in the living room, but the shed had become both a sanctuary and a burden. He would open the door in the mornings, glance over the uniform, the pistol, the letters, and the sack of old bills, then close it again as though afraid to disturb something fragile. But he could not shake the feeling that the air in there was changing, that the scent of age and metal seemed sharper, that the shadows seemed to stretch longer over the workbench. 2 days after the first tire tracks, Harold came by again. His visit was casual in tone, but laced with an edge that Ezra had not heard before. They spoke on the porch, the wind carrying the faint smell of rain from the west. Harold mentioned, with the offhand air of gossip, that there had been strangers in town, asking about old properties and who'd lived in them back in the day. "Could be nothing," Harold said, leaning on the railing. "But sometimes when folks start poking around in the past, they ain't doing it for history's sake." He didn't look directly at Ezra when he said it. Ezra offered only a small nod, unwilling to invite more speculation, but the words rooted themselves in his thoughts. That night, the sound of a car passing on the road pulled him from a shallow sleep. It slowed as it approached his property, the crunch of tires on gravel distinct in the quiet. He got up, moving to the window, but the darkness outside was thick and the headlights washed over the fence before turning away. He stood there for a long time afterward, listening for any sound that didn't belong, and when he finally lay back down, sleep did not come. The next morning, he went to the shed earlier than usual. The lock was still in place, but for a moment he thought he saw the faintest scuff marks in the dirt near the door. He crouched down, running his hand over them, but they could have been from an animal or from his own boots on a damp day. Still, the idea that someone might have been close enough to touch the shed's door made his jaw tighten. He unlocked it and stepped inside, scanning the workbench. Everything was as he had left it, but he noticed the faint shift in the pile of letters, as if they had been disturbed and placed back without care. He told himself he might have left them like that himself. He wanted to believe it. Later that afternoon, as he was stacking wood near the porch, a man approached from the road. He was tall, with a lined face and a cap pulled low, his coat zipped against the wind. He introduced himself as someone interested in the history of the area, and asked, in a voice that was too casual to be natural, if Ezra had found anything unusual on his land in all the years he'd lived there. Ezra's answer was a steady, quiet no, but the man's eyes lingered on the yard, then drifted toward the shed. There was a pause before he tipped his cap and walked back toward the road. his steps unhurried, as though he wanted Ezra to watch him go. By evening, the wind had picked up, rattling the loose tin on the side of the shed. Ezra sat at the kitchen table with the dog tags in front of him, turning them over in his hands. He thought about Thomas K. King, about the warning in one of the letters to keep the box safe. He wondered if the man who had buried it had felt this same tension in the air, the same awareness that once something was hidden, it became both a shield and a target. The following day, he decided to move the items from the shed into the house, at least for the time being. He waited until the road was quiet, then carried them in, one piece at a time, setting them carefully in a large, old trunk in the corner of his living room. The pistol he wrapped in a cloth before placing it inside. The sack of money he tucked beneath the folded uniform. The letters he slid between layers of fabric to keep them safe. When the trunk was locked, he felt a measure of relief, but it was a fragile thing, easily broken by the knowledge that locks only kept out the unmotivated. The days grew shorter, the evenings stretching into long hours of listening to the house settle and the wind scrape along the eaves. Twice he thought he heard voices outside at night, faint and quickly gone, but when he stepped onto the porch, there was nothing but the dark and the restless trees. He began to understand that the quiet he had valued for so long could turn into a kind of pressure, a blank space into which unwanted things could creep. It was just after dusk one evening when he saw the figure again, this time standing openly at the edge of the yard near the fence. The man didn't move when Ezra stepped onto the porch. He only watched. There was a pause, long enough for Ezra to feel the weight of the stare, before the man turned and walked away into the shadows. Ezra remained on the porch for a while after that, his breath clouding in the cold, the thought of the trunk in the living room settling over him like a second layer of frost. That night, as he lay in bed, Ezra realized that whatever had been buried in his yard all those years ago had not been forgotten by everyone. The shadows were closer now, their interest sharpened, and he understood that this was no longer just about uncovering the past. The past had noticed him, and it was moving toward his door. The night after he saw the figure by the fence was the longest Ezra could remember in years. He lay in bed with his eyes open, staring into the dark, the slow creak of the house settling like faint footsteps overhead. Every time the wind brushed past the siding or rattled the loose tin on the shed, he felt his muscles tighten. It wasn't fear exactly. It was the knowledge that whatever had been set in motion the moment he dug into that mound was now moving toward its conclusion. He could almost feel the pull of it, like the slow current of a deep river drawing everything toward one inevitable bend. By morning, his mind was clear. The uncertainty, the careful waiting, the false hope that this might simply pass had all worn thin. He brewed his coffee, but barely drank from the cup. Instead, he sat at the kitchen table staring at the old trunk in the corner, its heavy brass latch glinting in the pale light filtering through the curtains. Inside lay the uniform, the pistol, the money, the letters, and the dog tags, the weight of another man's life, and the shadow of the danger that life had left behind. He realized then that he could not keep them, not if he wanted peace to return to this house. The decision was not one he made lightly. For years, Ezra had lived with the quiet certainty that his life was his own, bound to his land and his memories, free from the tangled affairs of other people. But this was no longer just his land, and these were no longer just his memories. He had stepped into someone else's story, and with that step came responsibility. The thought of the strangers in town, of the man who had stood in the dark by his fence, made it plain enough. If these things had value beyond sentiment, they would draw attention until someone took them by force. That afternoon, he called a man he knew from his service days, a retired sheriff named Miles Turner who lived 2 counties over. He didn't tell him everything over the phone, only that he had found something that might be of historical and legal importance, and that he wanted it handled properly. Miles didn't ask many questions, just said he'd be there the next morning. With the decision made, Ezra felt a strange calm settle over him, though it was tinged with a kind of sorrow. He spent the evening with the trunk open, looking over each piece one last time. The uniform still carried the faint scent of age and damp earth, the fabric rough under his fingertips. The pistol, cleaned now, the worst of the rust, was cool and solid in his palm, a tool made for certainty in uncertain moments. He ran his thumb over the engraved initials on the cigarette case, and for a fleeting moment imagined the face of Thomas K. King, though he had only that faded newspaper photograph to guide him. The letters were the hardest to part with. He read several that night, letting the voice of Annie King come through the paper, steady and warm at first, then more urgent and edged with fear as the months went on. There was love in her words, but also a desperate need to protect her brother from whatever shadow had been creeping into his life. Ezra folded each one carefully and returned it to its bundle. When dawn came, pale and cold, he was already awake. He had packed the trunk with the same care he might have used for his own most precious possessions. He wrapped the pistol separately in an oiled cloth, the money in thick brown paper, the letters between folded layers of the uniform to keep them from bending. By the time Miles's old pickup pulled into the drive, the trunk was closed and waiting by the door. Miles was a big man, his frame still broad despite the years, his handshake firm. He listened in silence as Ezra told the story from the beginning. The mound, the digging, the box, the contents, the strangers who had appeared afterward. When Ezra was finished, Miles nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "You did right calling me," he said finally. "This is bigger than you want it to be." They carried the trunk out together and set it in the bed of the truck, covering it with a heavy tarp. Miles assured him it would go first to a secure location, then into the hands of people who could determine its rightful place, whether that meant a museum, an archive, or the family of Thomas K. King, if any could be found. Ezra didn't press for details. He trusted Miles to see it through. When the truck pulled away, the yard seemed oddly quiet, as if holding its breath. Ezra stood on the porch for a long time, watching the faint plume of exhaust fade into the cold air. The ground where the mound had been was just bare earth now, the scar slowly softening under winter's touch. He knew that with the trunk gone, the interest from the shadows would fade. Whatever had drawn them here no longer rested on his land. In the days that followed, he noticed the difference. No more tire tracks appeared by the fence, no figures lingered in the distance at dusk. The nights were still and dark in the way they had always been before, the kind of quiet that settled in the bones and let a man sleep deeply. Yet something had changed in him. He felt a connection to the man whose name had once been nothing more than letters on cold metal, a connection forged through the weight of objects and the silence of years. Spring would come in time, bringing grass back over the disturbed earth, and with it the slow erasure of the mound's memory from the land itself. But Ezra knew he would not forget. In the evenings, when he sat on the porch and the light faded into the trees, he sometimes imagined that somewhere, in a place he couldn't see, Thomas K. King had found a kind of peace too, The box had been hidden to keep its contents safe, but perhaps after all these years, the truest safety lay in bringing them back into the light. The last of the frost melted from the yard one morning, and Ezra walked to the edge where the mound had once stood. The soil was still bare, but he had brought with him a small packet of seeds, wildflowers that would grow in a scatter of colors come summer. He knelt and pressed them into the earth with steady hands. It was not a grave, but it felt like one in spirit, a quiet marker for a man's life and the secrets it had carried. As he rose, he looked towards the shed, its leaning frame now just part of the backdrop of his days again. Turning back toward the house, Ezra felt the lightness that comes when a burden is finally set down. The past would always have its shadows, but for now they were no longer his to bear, and in the quiet that had returned, he could hear, for the first time in weeks, the simple and familiar sounds of home. Wind through the branches, the creak of the porch boards, and the distant call of a bird somewhere beyond the fence. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. Check out the next videos, and share this one with your friends so they can enjoy it too.